Hello and welcome into BTN's Take 10 podcast. This is Alex Roux of BTN, and we're one day removed from Big Ten Basketball Media Day. I know we've been talking a lot of Big Ten football here on the show in the first 5 or 6 weeks of the season, but it's time to kind of overlap a little bit. And as we've done the past couple years, soon after Big Ten Media Day, bring back Mike DeCourcy of the Sporting News and the Big Ten Network. He's an analyst for us as well, to preview the Big Ten basketball season. We're about a month away from first games tipping off, and I'm pretty sure there's no one out there who can go as in-depth on every Big Ten team in the span of about 45 minutes than Mike DeCourcy can. Every time I have him on, I'm kind of amazed at how he can just basically go 12 deep on every team and know their schedule and know who they played in years past, and really just go in depth 1 through 14 in the Big Ten, and he does that for the next 45 minutes or so coming up on this episode of the Take 10 podcast. So really extensive Big Ten basketball preview with Mike. He talks about what he saw at Wednesday's Big Ten Media Day in the Chicagoland area, and we also squeeze some football talk in, not with Mike, but after Mike wraps up with our weekly in-house guest, Harold Shelton. If you're not familiar with the show, Harold is our BTN researcher, and he hops on pretty much every week in Big Ten football and basketball season to talk about the weekly matchups and the trends and stats and analytics and all that good stuff. And Harold and I talk Big Ten football from this past week and what is coming up this weekend in the sport. So healthy dose of both football and basketball as that time of year approaches, where the Venn diagram kind of crosses and these sports start to blend. So jam-packed episode, a lot of good stuff. We'll get into Mike DeCourcy first. It's Take 10 podcast interview with Mike DeCourcy, and it starts right now. I'm very pleased to be joined once again by Mike DeCourcy, the longtime writer at the Sporting News and also a BTN basketball analyst. Follow him on Twitter at TSN Mike. Mike, welcome back. How's it going?
Very well, Alex. I'm excited to be getting ready for another year at BTN. It's going to be an interesting season in the league with probably, in a lot of ways, the strongest national championship contender on paper that the conference has had in a while, maybe going back to, say, 2013 when Indiana came into the year with such high expectations with Victor Oladipo and Zeller and all that group. So it should be really exciting, and yet even with Michigan State being such a great target for everyone, I do think there's a fair amount of depth in the conference as well.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into all that in just a moment. And you're right that the Spartans brought a ton of hype yesterday to Basketball Media Day. It's hard to believe that Basketball Media Day is already here. I think it was a full week earlier than last year, taking place on October 2nd. This is kind of our tradition now to catch up after Big Ten Basketball Media Day, and knowing that you're a fashion-conscious individual off the top, before we even talk basketball, I got to ask you, any fashion choices stand out from the contingent of Big Ten Media Day outfits yesterday?
I thought, when Archie Miller sat down he was the last coach to come in to sit at the podium during that portion of the day. They started. For those who did not watch on BTN, they started with each coach getting 10 minutes to question and answer period with reporters, and then after that they break it up to coaches and players sitting at tables, a little bit more one-on-one or one-on-10 interaction kind of deal. And so when he sat down, I right away, like his blazer, he had a sort of it wasn't a deep red blazer, but it was sort of a slightly sort of a rose red blazer that I thought just popped. I thought it was awesome. And then on Twitter I think it was Juwan Morgan saying that basically that Arch stole it from him. I don't think he literally stole it out of his closet, because I don't think Arch and Juwan are the same size, but according to Juwan, that was his color, that was his look, and and Arch took it over.
Yeah, it's kind of the natural progression of things because we've seen the players get more and more fashion conscious as we've gone along, and now I guess the only thing that's left is for the coaches to catch up. And another evolution I noticed yesterday was a couple players rocking the turtleneck look under the blazer. I'm not sure if you're a turtleneck guy, but I recently kind of adopted that in the past year or so. And in the winter and in the fall, it's kind of a good look. So I'm curious, do you have any turtlenecks in the closet?
I do not. I've never liked having all that up around my chin and all that. I don't mind the look, but I don't like the feel. And during I guess what it was probably a decade ago, maybe a little more than that, the mock turtleneck thing was big, and I know that Mike Bray has done his best to try to keep it alive, but that I kind of liked because it was a comfortable feel and a comfortable look. But I think those days are past, Mike Bray notwithstanding.
Yeah, it's Tiger Woods and Mike Bray with mock turtleneck, and then I think the kind of the hip hop culture and some Hollywood culture has kind of brought turtlenecks back in vogue. So look out for that this fall and winter. Maybe some coaches will get into it on the sideline. Moving on beyond fashion, though, and before we get into basketball, it's been a theme when I've talked to you in the last couple of years that there's kind of a big story that looms and hovers over the proceedings of Big Ten Media Day. And the last couple of years, it's been the FBI investigation into college hoops that was going on. And, while valuable insights were definitely uncovered and some schools are kind of still being looked into as a result of that, it definitely didn't have the wide sweeping impact on the sport that some thought as it was kind of unfolding as we look in the rearview mirror. And this year, because of the timeliness of what's going on, the topic of athlete image and likeness and the new California law regarding college athletes getting compensated was the major story being discussed. So I'm curious if you think this rule will have a widespread impact and a longer-lasting impact that may be longer than maybe the FBI investigation did that kind of fizzled out as we talked about the last couple of years.
The concept of name, image, and likeness will have a revolutionary impact on college sports. I don't think there's any question that it's coming, and that the question is how it will be arranged, and we still won't know that for a long time. But the whole California thing is the biggest crock that I've seen lately. California's doing this is not going to have any impact other than on the couple of weeks of conversation it's going to have generated. Because the NCAA is not going to move because California said move. And they're not going to move because South Carolina, Pennsylvania, or whoever else say move. They can't do that. There's a case in court that involves this as an item, and the NCAA is not going to move unilaterally on this item toward the idea of granting name, image, and likeness and put themselves at risk to expand the class of people that will be affected by it beyond the future and or current at the time they would institute it, student athlete. They're not going to put themselves at risk of having to pay back pay, so to speak. They ended up having to do that when they went ahead and passed full cost of attendance for student athletes. When they did that, they wound up in a settlement that cost them over $200 million. And they learned a lesson there. They did the right thing in cost of attendance. They had to do it. It was never right that they didn't. And back I think when Commissioner Delaney was playing, I think they still had what they called laundry money, and eventually that was eliminated. And during the period, it's 3 decades, maybe 4, that it didn't exist. It was never right. So it was good that the NCAA went ahead and gave full cost of attendance to various student athletes through the schools that were willing to pay it. But it cost them a lot of money in back pay, for lack of a better term. And so they're not going to do that again. Now, if the federal government says, okay, you have to do this, if the federal government could actually get together on one bill and pass it and get it signed, then they would have to do it, and that might get them off the hook for that. But individual states doing it is not going to change that. It may possibly lead the NCAA to accept a settlement or verdict or whatever in that case that they don't want to accept. I guess verdict's probably the wrong word, but a settlement in regards to the case that involves NIL, name, image, likeness. They might accept that they don't really want, but they're not going to change the rule unilaterally.
Yeah, and I think with a discussion this complex and with things getting lost in translation and social media arguments springing up, I think the clarity of what's going on needs to be looked at, because first of all, a lot of people don't understand, like on Twitter, that this is not about schools paying players a salary. It's players profiting off image and likeness. And I think people are also kind of looking at it in an archaic way about how this would play out. I mean, I keep seeing like the car dealership example. If this rule goes into effect, like the local car dealership will pay athlete X to be in a commercial. But I see this, if this eventually takes hold, it's mainly going to be players kind of being 21st century, influencers. Like they're going to be acting as Instagram influencers, doing the Cameo app, opening their Venmo accounts. And I just think the way I see this being discussed, it's not being understood that clearly, and it's being kind of framed in uncertain ways. There's a lot of clarity that needs to take effect, I think, just in the national discussion.
The NCAA appointed a committee in May to start to look at ways that this can be implemented. And so it's not as if they woke up and California had passed this bill and they were like, oh gosh, what are we going to do now? I mean, I don't think there's any question, again, that they're moving toward it. When Condoleezza Rice had the press conference at the conclusion of the Rice Commission's work last April 2018, they were immediately asked, well, why didn't you move on name, image, likeness here? And she said then, I think she actually preempted the question because she didn't take any questions from the media at large. But I think that she preempted the question by saying there was litigation on this, and so we can't do anything yet. And I didn't really understand that at the time. So then I went ahead and I talked to some people at the NCAA, and they explained the part about what I talked about, that if they move on it without dealing with this case first, then they could end up having to pay in the same way they did on cost of attendance. So that's why we are in the position we are, but the NCAA is anticipating a move, and they're trying to figure it out. The idea that you said about the car dealers that's an active possibility, and that's something that they have to figure out how to address. Do they want that in their game? I don't think they do. So how do you do this without that being an issue? And those are the tough questions that they have to ask and have to resolve. I think you're right that there are lots of different ways that this could be, lots of different avenues it could open up for athletes to monetize their name rights. I mean, there's also autograph signings. There's the possibility of lecturing at a camp. There's even the possibility of starting your own camp if you wanted to go to all that trouble of having a clinic or something like that for kids in your region or whatever, or start a basketball camp. You'd have to staff it and run it and all that. It's a lot of trouble, and I don't know that most kids would want to do that. But if you were a small college that wanted to draw kids in to your basketball camp, you could say, hey, All-American guard so-and-so is going to appear at our camp, so pay your $400, $500 or whatever it costs to go to basketball camp these days and come hear him as well as all the other coaches that are going to be here. I think that's a possibility. So there are a lot of different ways that athletes could monetize their name and likeness, but the NCAA has to figure out how to make it so that it's not car dealer from state U against car dealer from state Tech. I'm pretty sure they don't want that in their games.
Yeah, it's, like I said, a complex issue. It's something that's going to be played out over years. It's not going to be resolved anytime soon. It's gonna be something interesting to follow, and it's just interesting how the last few media days there's always been some overarching debate that's hovered over the proceedings. But anyway, let's move on to talk basketball. Let's break down what you said should be an exciting year in the Big Ten, just with Michigan State being at the top. So we'll start there with bona fide national title contender. So my question for you is, how wide do you think the gap between Michigan State and the next tier of Big Ten teams is at this point?
Well, first of all, I think some of that's to be determined by Maryland. They are very talented, but they also lost a foundational player, Bruno Fernando, who was such a difference maker for them. I mean, if Bruno were back, and I'm not saying he should have returned, I'm just saying if Maryland had returned with Bruno Fernando on its roster, I don't know that there would be that big a gap at all. But they have a huge hole to fill, but they also have a large complement of talented players. I mean, they have a 4-year starter at point guard. What a luxury that is with Anthony Cowan. They've got an army of young wings, some of whom have had spectacular moments. They've all had good moments and moments where they made difference-making plays in victories at the Big Ten level. So they have a lot. They don't have what Michigan State has, which is a reasonable amount of certainty at every position. Yesterday at Big Ten Media Day, Tom Izzo talked about how they lost, I think, 30 points and X number of rebounds. And yes, but one of the players that you lost, Matt McQuaid, who was a wonderful player, he was basically taking most of the minutes that were left behind by Joshua Langford when he got hurt and Joshua was back. And Nick Ward in the center was injured late and wound up being supplanted by Xavier Tillman. And the reality is they were a better basketball team with Xavier, more versatile defender, a more aggressive and consistent player, and not a huge decline in terms of his offense. He can face up, he can make a jump shot, he finishes plays in the offensive on the offensive glass. He's not really a low post guy, but he's probably going to end up averaging somewhere around the same number of points and rebounds that Nick Ward would have if he'd stayed another year. So I don't think that's a huge loss in either department as long as Josh is healthy. Josh has been back on the court for about 2 weeks, I think, 2.5 weeks, I think Tom said. And I talked to him yesterday, and he said he feels good. But obviously there's the uncertainty of what he'll be and how consistent he can be until he gets back out there and does it.
Looking kind of into that next tier, Maryland has more experience than a team like Ohio State. Ohio State probably added more talent through a guy like E.J. Liddell and some of the freshmen they're bringing in. Do you think Ohio State is in Maryland's tier, and are they a top 4 Big Ten team?
Yes, I do definitely think that most of the consensus seems to be that you've got Michigan State at the top, Maryland slotting in behind them, and then Ohio State and Purdue is kind of like an ice cream flavor kind of deal where a lot of people prefer Ohio State, a lot of people prefer Purdue, but everybody kind of looks at them as being the next couple of teams. And then from 5 down, you have the idea that a lot of teams could go, maybe from 5 to 11, 5 to 12, you have a lot of teams that could go either way. That if all the breaks go their way, they could be really good. If all the breaks go against them, they could struggle, especially in a league with so many capable teams. But Ohio State looks like a solid team. You have a guy like Caleb Wesson, who is, really talented and a difference maker when he's on the floor. And people talk about the one concern with him is just staying on the floor more, playing smarter with, when he has fouls, trying to avoid fouls when he can. That was his biggest problem last year. But when he's on the floor, he's a difference maker. And you lose a really good point guard from a year ago in CJ, but you've got a freshman who everybody expects to replace him capably, and then you've got as well a vast array of wing players who are experienced and capable. Washington, Wesson, Jallo, Muhammad, all guys who are really capable players. Justin Arns had a big day or two last year. Guys who are really capable and could make difference for the Buckeyes. And so I think people feel really good about them being in the first division for sure.
Yeah, Weston was really slimmed down yesterday, I noticed, when he was walking around. He looked like he was in really good shape. You mentioned Purdue, and we know that they've proven more than enough times in recent years that it's kind of unwise to doubt their ability to reload. Wisconsin's kind of in a similar situation where lost a lot of production, but I think most expect them to have a pretty good year. So how do you see those two teams stacking up? I know you kind of alluded to the fact that Purdue might be in that top tier and Wisconsin maybe a little bit below that, but how do you see those programs reloading after losing quite a bit of production?
Well, with Purdue, what Matt Painter has shown is how adaptable he is. I mean, one year his star player is a low post guy that you can throw the ball to, who catches everything and can turn and score, and also can come out and face and make threes, and you're a power team. And then the next year, all of a sudden you got Carson Edwards shooting 25-footers, and they win both ways. And they win because at the core, they don't ever change. They may change tactics and techniques, but they don't ever change the identity that they're going to defend you, that they're going to play together, that they're going to play to win, and guys are going to embrace whatever role develops for them on the team. And that's how they win. And then they work around, offensively, they work around whoever can make buckets. And so that, this year I would think that they're not going to have quite the versatility that Caleb Swanigan gave them in terms of inside-outside, but they've got a guy in Travion Williams. They can throw the ball and create offense with anybody. I mean, he's a terrific low-post option in terms of his ability to turn and score, but also he's an excellent passer. So he's going to find guys. If he draws double teams, he's going to find guys and make the right play. And you've got Matt Harms, who I think they're going to try to play them together and be really destructive physically along the baseline. And one of the interesting things is with what they lost from a year ago, losing Ryan Klein and Carson Edwards, a lot of people said, well, who's going to make shots? And Matt came out right away yesterday in his podium portion of the press conference and said, we got a lot of guys who can make shots. And people, I know right away, my head was up. Wait, he said that? He said they got guys who can shoot? Well, then they don't have a lot of problems then. He's talked a lot about Sasha Stefanovic, who a year ago what really struggled, and he explained Sasha's struggles, and it really made sense, is that when you're a shooter, if you miss a shot, you want to get that next one. And the problem Sasha had was he might miss a shot, and not for any reason other than it was time to get Klein back in the game. Sasha would come out, and then that one missed shot would sit on him and weigh on him for a lot of time, and then he'd get back on the floor, and he wasn't quite as confident and as happy as he'd been. So he's been really good, according to Matt. He's been really good in practice. He said he's been shooting well over 40% from the new three-point line, and he's really excited about him. And then you've got guys like Eric Hunter, who played a nice role a year ago, Aaron Wheeler, who is really physically gifted. And anyone who saw last year saw that he has the ability to make a shot. Now he's got to be a guy. He's got to be someone that you can count on to score double figures, not just, hey, look what he can do when he has an opportunity. He's got somebody that is going to have to be able to go out there and do it game after game, be in the vicinity of double figures, be someone that's confident enough in all that. I mean, he doesn't necessarily have to come out and shoot Carson Edwards level load of the offense, but he's got to be someone that's really reliable. So I think all those things play into what they're capable of, and I didn't even mention Nogel Eastern, who, while he's someone that you would call a unique player, not a great shooter, not even really a dazzling passer when you think about it. I mean, it's not like you're putting a 6'7" Penny Hardaway out there, but he knows how to play. He makes plays. He makes the right pass. He makes the play to open up an easy pass. Okay, maybe he doesn't see out of the back of his head the way Penny could, but he knows how to make the right play. And then defensively, he's just a terror. So that's a guy that they can really rely on. They know exactly what they're going to get from him. And now they have had a year where he's been the full-time guy, so they know how to play off him. They know how to play to his strengths. So all that combined really puts Purdue, I think, in a really good position. And as far as the Badgers, one of the interesting things about them to me is that when I was talking to people over the summer in the offseason, whatever, well, what are they going to do without Hap? I mean, he was so much a part of their offense. He was such a big part of what they did. And I've talked to people inside the program, and they're like, look, we loved Ethan. I mean, he was great. Who wouldn't want that guy? I mean, 20 and 10 almost every night. But because of the way he played, he took them away from being Wisconsin, which, again, wasn't a negative. But they had to morph to his talents because you don't ignore what he could do. But now they can go back with the guys they have. With Micah Potter coming in, with Kobe King's athleticism, with Brad Davidson's competitiveness, and most of all with Nate Reaver's versatility, they can be the kind of Wisconsin team that we saw in the early 2010s, back when John Lure played, even before that. They can be more like that kind of team and play, more closer to the swing offense. And I think they feel really confident that they can be successful based on being able to go back to what's the heart of their program.
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right that it opens up kind of a fresh dynamic. I have a guy that's really close to me at work who is a big Wisconsin fan, and he kind of said all last year that they might be better without Hap coming up. So it'll be interesting to see what the removal from that roster does for the dynamic of that Wisconsin offense. Moving on to kind of the darling and the dark horse sleeper, whatever you want to call it, for this upcoming season. And I'm referring to Illinois because they lost 21 games last year. I think that was a program record for losses. But they did beat Michigan State, Maryland, Ohio State, went on a nice run, and it showed some flashes with Ayo Dosunmu and Georgi Bashanishvili, and some nice recruiting wins for Brad Underwood that'll boost the team coming in this year. I want to get your opinion on if you think the Illini can make a jump that really is necessary for a team that has been off the national radar since they last made the tournament 6 years ago. Do you think that they are getting the appropriate amount of hype? Do you think the fringe top 25 projections are accurate?
Well, that's a big jump from sub 500, I believe they finished a year ago, to top 25. That's a long way to go. A lot of guys have to do a lot of winning to get to top 25. And you're talking top 25 is a 6 seed. That's a big leap. I mean, just getting in from where they've been and certainly from where they were last year is the kind of leap that if they make it, they're going to be ecstatic. If they make it, they've got the guys, a guy like the Sumu who can be a difference maker in the tournament and make them a difficult out regardless of what their seed is. I think they were close a year ago, closer than people realize. And I think the biggest problem for Illinois last year, the thing that really got them, was their schedule early was just brutal. It was overwhelming. And I don't think they ever recovered from the fact that they were asked to do so much early on. And they were close at Notre Dame. They were close in some of their other games. They were close out when they were out in Maui. They had a couple of games where they could have gone either way. And I think their schedule this time is more reasonable, more manageable. They get more, they get more games early. I mean, they have to play Arizona and all that, and Grand Canyon's not going to be easy either. But they have 3 or 4 games to try to figure out how to win after that, and then they get into a difficult stretch. But their Big Ten Challenge game is a home game, and it's not against a heavyweight. Miami should be better than they were a year ago, but again, you're not having to play Duke or whatever. And then they start league play, and everybody's going to have to play in the league. And then they play later in the month they play the bragging rights game. But they're not weighed down by the overscheduling situation that they were in a year ago. So I think they have a chance to develop a formula. When you haven't won, learning to win is a big thing. Learning how to make the plays at the end of the game that are winning plays. That's enormous in college basketball, because a lot of games that you play, the most important games that you play, are going to be close in the final 5 minutes. And one team is accustomed to winning, and often the other team is accustomed to not winning. And very often that decides the game. The team that has been used to winning knows what to do to finish those games. The team that hasn't won doesn't have the confidence, the understanding of what it takes to get to that 40th minute. And so I think that they can have an opportunity here with the way they've scheduled for this year to put themselves into position to go in the heart of the Big Ten with a better understanding of how to close out those difficult games.
Yeah, it was uncanny how the same type of situation kind of played out for them at the end of games last year, whether it was, like you said, Notre Dame or Gonzaga or even a Florida Atlantic, where they just didn't know how to win early on, and they kind of figured it out moving forward. We got a pair of new coaches in the Big Ten this year. Programs are definitely at different places in their trajectories, but Juwan Howard enters the fold at Michigan, and Fred Hoiberg is at Nebraska, which took me a bit by surprise. I didn't expect him to jump back into college basketball the way he did necessarily, but they're there. And the Michigan situation definitely is a surprise as well. If you would have told someone a year ago, they would not have believed you, or at least would have been skeptical. So what are you looking to see from the new coaches in the Big Ten, considering where their programs are at, and with them both being NBA, having NBA experience and bringing that to the conference?
Well, in the case of Fred, I think that he'll do very well there. He has his own experience to sell. He has, and by that I mean not necessarily being the mayor and being an NBA player. I'm talking about his experience at Iowa State with players like Monte Morris, who wound up in the league, and George Niang, who I believe at least got a run through the league, and I think he's playing overseas now. And then as well, the various transfers he was able to get and solve. And what I mean by solve is a lot of the transfers that he took went in there with problematic pasts. Not all of them, but a good many of them went in with disciplinary issues or maybe personality conflicts with coaches at their previous programs, and went there and no problems. And so he's got that to sell, and he's also got what he talked about at Media Day, which unquestionably, as loyal a fan base as anyone in the country has, and they show up. And I can tell you that even on days when I was working in the studio and they had a snowstorm and the lights went on and the game came on and there were still people there, and it's like, wait a second. I mean, if I remember right, I think one of our color commentators had trouble getting to the game, and yet they're all there. So that shows how devoted they are. So it's hard to play at Nebraska. That's a big thing. That some of the programs in the country, some in the league, don't have the advantage of. That they can't count on their home crowd to make it difficult for the opposition. Nebraska always can. And then as well, they invested heavily in the program 5 years ago, with incredible facilities obviously from the arena, but also to the practice facility they have. So he's got a lot to sell. I think he's going to do fine. It may take some time. It's hard to tell because we don't We haven't seen most of their guys play anywhere, let alone at Nebraska. So it may take some time, or they may surprise us. If any success they have, I think, will surprise us immediately. But over time, it's going to get good there. They're going to be a team that people in the Big Ten have to really pay attention to. As far as Michigan is concerned, it's an interesting situation for Juwan because he doesn't have a track record as a head coach, but he walks into a pretty good group of players. I mean, he's got basically three starters who were on a Sweet 16 team a year ago, in Isaiah Livers, in John Teskey, and in Xavier Simpson. Livers didn't start every game, but I mean, anybody who looked at the Big Ten last year knows Isaiah Livers was a starting quality player. So he's got those three guys. He's got a few guys to fill in around them. He's got some recruits who can make a difference as well, and he has to grow comfortably into the head coaching role pretty quickly. And I don't envy him. Because it would be like giving me Frank DeFord's job in a way, I got to follow that guy. I mean, having to follow John Beilein as respected a tactician as there has been in college basketball over the last 25 years, that's a tough deal. And I don't envy Juwan at all that. But I got a chance. I didn't know Juwan. Obviously, he'd been in the league for 20 years, and I don't cover that much NBA. And in terms of his college experience, I just covered him at a couple of Final Fours, so you don't really get to know anybody in that environment. So I didn't know him, and I got a chance to be around him some at Media Day. It's very impressive, really enthusiastic, interesting answers to every question, a lot of thoughtful material he provided us. So I was very enthused after spending some time around him with what he might be able to bring. It's just, like I said, that tough transition from, of having to follow somebody as legendary as John Beilein. That's a tough ask.
Absolutely. And you mentioned Howard being, personable and introspective. And I noticed both Howard and Hoiberg, I know they want to make good first impressions, but they were both really engaging in our one-on-one interactions and really in good spirits, and it was good to see that, and interested to see what both can do. A couple of teams out east I wanted to touch on because they both kind of intrigued me. Penn State's been a team that feels like it's been knocking on the door in the last 3 or 4 years under Pat Chambers, and he's going to try again now with a pretty familiar group, and that's led by one of the best players in the conference, Lamar Stevens. And then Rutgers has just been slowly building this thing under Steve Peichel, and they broke through last year with more Big Ten wins than they had, I think, combined in the last several seasons. Which of those teams, or maybe both, do you think has a chance to make some noise in the Big Ten and maybe make a run of the tournament? I think Penn State has a higher ceiling, but do you think either team or maybe both have postseason potential?
I do. I put them in the group of teams that I feel better about in that 5 or 6 to 12 range. I would put those two teams in the group that I feel like has more potential and needs fewer miracles, so to speak. I mean, they just sort of have to play well to be good. Penn State, for instance, I mean, losing Rasheer Bolton was a blow because he was the one guy that could be a dynamic offensive point guard for them. But they don't have to deal with his occasional shot selection issues, and they can work more toward a specific identity. Obviously, that's going to start with defense with this group because it starts at the point with Jamari Wheeler. Can Jamari become a more dynamic offensive point guard? I'll be interested to see if he can. And if not, can they find other ways to generate offense? And I talked to Lamar Stevens, and I told him Lamar is the first player that I voted for an award from a losing team that I can remember. I mean, he was that great last year. He had a phenomenal Big Ten season, and usually if it's close between a couple of players, I'm going with the guys that win because they won, and that's the object of the game. But Lamar made Penn State better last year. And he kept going when a lot of teams and a lot of guys could have just said, oh, the heck with this. I mean, they had such a tough start to league play. And he kept driving, and he started making a difference. And he had a phenomenal year. So do they run their offense through him as a facilitator as well as a target? He suggested that they might. And so that may be a way around losing a guy like Bolton. And they certainly have guys who can make baskets. Miles Dredd is going to be he's a guy who ought to be able to shoot high 30s, low 40s from three-point range. They were very positive, and I haven't seen Isaiah Brockington yet, but they were very positive in conversation about what he can add. And then they were very enthused as a group about Mike Watkins. We all know is unbelievably talented, physically just massive and strong, can be a real difference maker on both ends with his physicality, and hasn't been healthy in a lot of ways for much of his career at Penn State. And Pat Chambers said that Mike's in terms of his health, is in the best position he's been in for a very long time. And so you've got that, and then you've got the reliability that John Harrop gives you for when for if Mike needs a break, and hopefully it's never anything more than that. But to know that you've got a guy like John who always is in the right place and is really physically powerful around the rim, I think there's a lot there. But they also talked about Curtis Jones, who started his career at Indiana and now is back in the Big Ten at Penn State. And, they were very enthusiastic about him. I'll hold a wait and see on that because I remember his Indiana career. Not that he was bad, but he wasn't a difference maker. So we'll see whether or not he can live up to what they sold him as at Media Day. But there's enough guys I mentioned there that there's a team and a team that should be competitive. They're one of the teams that I was mentioning, though, when I said that they need better crowd support to be the team that they can be. I mean, you should have to play against a crowd in this league, and you do it almost every other stop. You go to Maryland, you've been there. You go to Ohio State in a big game, and it's hard to play. And obviously, places like Illinois and Indiana and Purdue and Michigan State, I mean, those are tough places to play. Penn State needs to be a tough place to play as well as a tough team. That may be the biggest challenge of all for the Nittany Lions. For as far as Rutgers is concerned, it's such a shame for them that they lost Eugene Omoruyi to transfer. That was a brutal blow to them because they knew exactly what he could provide. He'd been such a consistent player and such a consistent person up until he decided to take off. They really, I sort of expected that there might be some temptation to transfer by some of their guys because they were good enough and because they hadn't gotten there yet in terms of a winning program. But honestly, if I had to rank their roster or their rotation 1 to 12 or 1 to 9, I would have probably put Eugene at 9th in terms of the likelihood that he would leave, and yet he did. But the guys who are returning, there's still a lot there. Like Caleb McConnell, I think he's really capable. I think that Ron Harper Jr. is really capable. I think that we've seen Geo Baker be a really good Big Ten player on bad or mediocre Big Ten teams. Now it's time for him to be a really good Big Ten player on a really good Big Ten team. And they certainly have the depth and physical power up front. And then do they have a point guard? And I think that's the question that they have to answer. They've played Geo there. They've played Caleb there. They've done all of that. But, is that the answer for them? Or can the freshman Mulcahy, can he be the guy who allows everybody else to do what they do best. Whether it's the guys I mentioned or Peter Kiss or Montez Mathis, if Mulcahy, who averaged a triple-double in high school, if he can be a facilitator, he's a big point guard, so he sort of fits in with everybody else that they have. They're all kind of big and long. So if he can be a facilitator and make those other guys better, and more important than anything, allow those guys to play where they're best, I think that Rutgers has a chance to be very good.
All right, Mike, the last kind of group of teams that we haven't addressed yet, I kind of categorize them as teams that lost a lot from last year. I mean, Northwestern, Minnesota, Indiana certainly did, and then even Iowa, if you consider Jordan Bohannon potentially missing the entire year with an injury, that's still kind of cloudy as far as what's going to happen with him. But do you think there's a tournament potential or intriguing potential among that group? The group is kind of being projected for the most part as bottom half Big Ten teams. Do you think that any of those squads can replenish what they lost? And there's certainly talent remaining on every one of those teams, but how do you see that remaining group kind of shaking out, and will any rise up into the top half of the Big Ten?
Yeah, I think the team that has the least, maybe the least proven players, but also the least issues is Indiana. I mean, they don't have a guy like Joe Wieskamp. They don't have somebody like that's as good as he is, or has been as good as he is as a Big Ten player. But they also don't have a lot of, they don't have a lot of holes. They know who their point guard is. They know that they've got wings. They know they've got size. They added Joey Brunk to Deron Davis in the middle. So they know what they've got. They just need to know what they've got, if you know what I mean. And so that to me is really fascinating, that they can go into the year with a degree of certainty about who will play, but then they have to establish who they are. You look at Iowa, they don't know who they are because they don't know if Jordan will play, and I suspect that they don't expect him to. But if he doesn't, then they don't know who their point guard is, and that's their most important. That's the most important position on anybody's team. And they lost, a lot of talent in the front court. They still have some size, but they're going to have to be arranged differently. They're probably more reliant on freshmen than some of the other teams. But they've done it before. Fran's a very capable coach. So it's sort of a let's see how it works out kind of deal. And I hope Jordan plays for his sake, because that means he's healthy. But I don't know the answer to that. There was a lot of pessimism with the initial injury, and I haven't heard anybody, retreat from that initial pessimism.
Yeah, and Minnesota and Northwestern, teams with, I'd say, a certain amount at stake. And, Minnesota brings Oturu back. Northwestern has gains and some interesting transfers. Do you see anything out of those two teams that suggests that, they could surprise some people?
Well, let's not forget that that Minnesota brings back two guys who were basically, all freshman players, Gabe Kalsher and Daniel Oturu. I don't know whether either or both was on the team, but they were all freshman type players. So there's two really good pieces there. And then also Eric Curry. I mean, if he plays 35 games healthy, that's three really good pieces. And all the rest is unproven, at least in terms of playing in the Big Ten. I mean, Marcus Carr played for Pitt, did some good things, but he was on a pretty dreadful team. So I don't know whether that translates or not. I think they were very much enthused about trying to get him eligible a year ago. It didn't happen. They're probably going to need him more this year than they would have a year ago. They had a pretty set rotation a year ago in the end, even after losing Curry. So I think they're going to be happy now that they have Carr, but he's going to have to prove himself. And I'm not saying the Big Ten's tougher than the ACC or anything like that, but like I said, I mean, he can go out and play for a team that I think won 0 league games as he did at Pitt in his year before transferring. If that's all you want, he can be a guy who plays on a team doesn't win any games. I don't think that's the goal. So he's got to show that he can play winning basketball as well.
Mike, a lot of great stuff. Learned a ton, so I'm sure our listeners did as well. Always great talking to you, and I appreciate your time. We'll see you around the studio soon here. I'm looking forward to basketball season. I know football's in full swing, but I'm ready to bring on some hoops.
We'll get there soon enough. I mean, gosh, the season starts, I think, November 5th, so it's really about a month from today with the huge Champions Classic at Madison Square Garden, and Michigan State goes in not as, they're here too. They are the headline team in a pretty stout group. I mean, this may be as close as we've ever had in that event to 1, 2, 3, 4. They've always all been pretty much in the ballpark, but I think they might be 1, 2, 3, 4 on most polls.
Can't wait, and looking forward to seeing you and your carefully crafted wardrobe walking around these halls here soon.
Thanks, Alex.
All right, Mike. Appreciate it. All right, thanks once again to Mike for joining me. Always generous with his time and his knowledge. And like I said at the top of the show, that well runs deep as far as what he knows and what he's seen in Big Ten basketball over the years. So appreciate him jumping on. We'll toss it over now to our PTN researcher, Harold Shelton. He is joining us for what we call the Stat Head segment, where, as I touched on at the top of the show, he'll go in depth on all things in this episode, Big Ten football. Want to definitely keep pace with what's going on in the football world while we introduce basketball and back into the show with that season approaching. But we are smack dab in the middle of a intriguing Big Ten football season, especially with some of the teams running roughshod at the top, Wisconsin and Ohio State. And Harold will make sure keep track of everything that's going on in the conference. So toss it over now to Harold Shelton. It's our conversation with BTN's head researcher. It starts right now. Excited to be joined once again by BTN stat head researcher Harold Shelton. H, switch back to football mode for me. I know we had hoops yesterday. What's good with you? How's your week been?
Week's been good. Hoops kind of threw me off a little bit, so I'm a little behind, but, we're getting back to it, and, we got some fun matchups coming up this weekend.
Yeah, for sure. Got a couple top 25 matchups within the Big Ten, which is pretty unique, right? Like, how often – that doesn't happen too often. I know you touched on it when we were kind of prepping for the show, but remind me of the stat and fill the folks in on the, I guess, unique nature of that occurrence.
Yeah, so it's the fourth time in the last 5 years that the league has had multiple ranked matchups in the same week.
Okay.
It doesn't sound like a lot, but when you consider in a 9-season span from 2006 to 2014, it only happened once. It just kind of shows like how deep the league has gotten. And now, we're getting really good games because of it.
Right, so maybe something that, wasn't commonplace a decade or two ago. As Big Ten is stacked, top 25 polls and all that. It's, like you said, speaks to the strength of the league. So that'll be fun. We will get into those matchups in a little bit here, but let's talk about briefly what happened this past weekend, even though it was almost 5 days ago now. I think at the top, just Penn State and Ohio State kind of making statements, and clearly, Ohio State continuing to separate itself from the rest of the pack, and Penn State clearly removing themselves from any conversation of them being lumped in with a Maryland, maybe some other of those teams in the East. Did anything stand out in really a pair of blowouts that, if you were a neutral fan, you knew was over by the end of the first quarter almost?
Yeah, I think I was probably more surprised with the Penn State one, just because they haven't looked as sharp as Ohio State has. I mean, Ohio State has, blown everybody off the field, and they've done it early. Penn State, they kind of struggled with Buffalo for a little more than a half. The Pitt game came down to, a coaching decision and, a Hail Mary attempt on the final play. So, they've had some shaky games. But that clearly was not the case in College Park. I felt like they had something to prove. It seems like whenever a team wants to challenge Penn State and become a rival of theirs, they kind of take that personally. Rutgers tried to do that when they first got to the league, and Penn State kind of shooed them away. And Maryland made a huge deal out of this game with the blackout and canceling Friday classes and all of that. And Penn State responded accordingly, and that's a series they continue to dominate.
Yeah, it's a good point about maybe taking it a little personally, because being at that game, by the end of the first quarter, you kind of tell that it was over, and just wanted to kind of get it rolling and get the clock moving a little bit. And Franklin was calling timeouts at the end of the second quarter, trying to get an extra score. We've seen him do that at the end of games. He was doing it at the end of half. So, definitely wanted to make a statement on that sideline for Penn State. Moving on, beyond, Ohio State obviously being really good, Minnesota's an interesting team that, might be from pretty good to really good. We don't really know. They're definitely solid so far because they're 4-0, and they've won every game by a very slim margin. So is there a historical context for what they're doing? They've won all 4 games, I think, by 1 possession, right? Who do they remind you of maybe in recent past or recent history of the Big Ten or in college football?
Yeah, so I guess so that's a two-parter for me. I would say that Minnesota, at least for the last year and a half, they're kind of Northwestern-esque when it comes to getting these close games and find a way to win in the fourth quarter. When it starts to happen, a couple times it's they get lucky, that all this can't continue. But Northwestern made a living of winning close games. The previous few years under Pat Fitzgerald, where it became part of their DNA. I'm not quite ready to say that Minnesota is going to turn into that, but to win 6 straight one-possession games, at some point it stops being luck. They're clearly well coached and don't panic in the moment, and they continue to find ways to win. I don't think that should be discounted.
Yeah, and looking at the rest of the weekend, full disclosure, I was caught up with some travel issues in the early part of Saturday, so I didn't see Iowa, I didn't see Wisconsin Northwestern, didn't see Michigan Rutgers. 2 of those games are blowouts, and then Wisconsin Northwestern got kind of interesting. I know there was some discussion about 2-point conversions and Fitzgerald going for that, and I did catch the end of Michigan State Indiana. So out of the rest of those games, did anything stand out to you? I know we probably didn't expect the Northwestern Wisconsin game to be as close as it was, but Wisconsin stayed perfect. So anything jump out that we should touch on before moving on?
We don't have to dwell on anything, but I could just have a couple quick hitters. I think we were ready to crown Wisconsin. I think we should probably take a step back, and even though they're really, really good, maybe they're not quite on the level of Ohio State as we try to make it seem.
The old pump brakes.
The jury might still be out. Defense really good though. I think the Michigan State defense, which we thought was all world, kind of got picked apart by a really good game plan and a redshirt freshman who completed 20 straight passes. There was a lot of things that we thought we knew. Stuff that happened on Saturday had to make us rethink some things a little bit, and that's the thing with college football. Every week is something different.
Sure. And one more thing to touch on. I don't know if you have this off the top of your head or top of your notes, but Chris Ash was fired on Sunday, so one day after getting blown out by Michigan. Is this the earliest firing in a while in the Big Ten? I'm trying to remember a mid-season firing. I know Tim Beckman was fired before week 1, a couple of years ago, and replaced with Bill Cubitt at Illinois. I'm trying to think of anything else historically that would measure up to that.
Yeah, I definitely remember some mid-October, early November firings, but through 5 weeks seems very rare. I
guess it's interesting that they waited for 5 weeks, after probably the 4-game rule, so you don't want to have a mass exodus of players.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And then I think they at least show some signs of life against BC. That game was relatively close, but then you follow that up with being shut out again. Mm-hmm. That's 2 straight in Big Ten play, and I think at a certain point you're kind of like, okay, we wanted to give you another year to show some progress. You really haven't shown it, and so I guess they decided to pull the plug and try to get a jump start on who the next guy will be.
It'll make the Rutgers games the rest of the year more intriguing, I think, and see if not only if those guys get up for those games on that roster. But if it was something like a case of them getting beat down under not that it was Ash's fault, but just kind of the same results over and over. We'll see if a spark is lit there. Let's look ahead now to this weekend. Just as of this episode dropping, just a day away from the games getting underway on Saturday. And we'll start with the two good matchups that you referred to at the top of the show. Iowa at Michigan. We got the number 14 team at number 19 Michigan. And Michigan, even though they did blow out Rutgers, I think those fans and everybody else is kind of waiting to see them get tested again for real. And Iowa's the team to do it. So what are you expecting out of this game? And who do you think comes out looking better? Because Iowa hasn't really looked too shaky all year. I know the Iowa State game was a close call, but Michigan, I think, is still way more uncertain about what they are. So what are you looking for out of this game?
I honestly don't know what to think of Iowa. I mean, Iowa, they've been very Iowa in terms of, they control the clock, third and time of possession. They don't turn it over. They don't commit penalties. So they've done all of the very Kirk Ferentz, Iowa ball style things that have allowed them to be successful for the better part of 2 decades. But the three of the 4 teams they've played are outside the top 100 in scoring offense. The other one is a decent team that just lost at Baylor the week before. You were outgained by 100 yards against Iowa State in that game, and you barely won it. So it's kind of hard for me to say that, how good they are, because we really don't know. At least with Michigan, we saw them play Wisconsin, and it was dicey, and they had to go back to the drawing board. This is the start of a really tough stretch. They still got Penn State, they got Notre Dame coming up, and so, we're going to find out a whole lot more about them. But I think Michigan actually is going to win the game. I think Iowa kind of gets exposed in the back 7, specifically in the secondary, if Michigan actually does throw the ball down the field. Iowa hasn't had success getting to the quarterback, which has been kind of a surprise considering how great A.J. Epinesa has been. So I think if Shea Patterson gets time to throw with those 3 receivers, that they'll make enough plays to pull it out.
One thing I'll be looking out for is, and I don't have the stats on this, but just it's one of those feel things. I feel like Iowa runs trick plays on the road a lot lately under Kirk. Like they did it against Penn State last year. They did it against Illinois last year. I'm looking for a trick play at Michigan, maybe first, second quarter.
Yeah, he definitely likes to pull them out early.
Maybe an onside kick or something.
Yeah, he had 2 or 3 in that Penn State game, and one that backfired big time, but a couple
one that
of them
worked,
that hit, though.
Yeah. So that'll be something to look out for.
Oh, yeah.
Moving on to the other ranked game, you have a special interest in this being our Michigan State guy, as we always say. Sparty at Ohio State. How does Michigan State keep this close, keep this a game? Do you think they have a chance? Give me the green and white take on this.
So Ohio State has a ridiculous first punch, and teams have not been able to recover from it. They stagger you in that first quarter, and then they just completely wipe you out in the second. And so, I was doing the numbers on this, and Ohio State has outscored teams 110-10 in the second quarter. In 5 games, teams have negative rushing yards combined in the second quarter. So that's why every game has been over with at halftime. Michigan State has to find a way to withstand that first half barrage, at least make it a game in the second half. Because at that point, then an untested Justin Fields will have to make some plays under pressure, which he hasn't had to do yet. And look, they're more talented than Michigan State. They probably have the advantage in most areas, but an area that Michigan State is really strong at is on the defensive line. So if they could find a way to corral J.K. Dobbins and make sure that he doesn't beat them, if Fields beats you over the top, you can live with that, as opposed to, the way Ohio State's been running the ball and everybody else.
Yeah, that formula, it almost sounds like, win the coin toss, receive, run the ball, control the clock, don't let Ohio State string possessions together in the first half, and maybe you have something. Connor Hayward gone, is that?
Yep, yeah, he entered the portal. Can't say I'm too surprised by that. He entered the year thinking he'd be the starting running back. Mm-hmm. He lost that job after a week. He was still playing, but not as much as I'm sure he would prefer. Best of luck to wherever he decides to go. I'm not sure if it's, FBS or if it's or I should say power conference or, group of 5. I'm not really sure, but can't say I was surprised to see him leave.
All right, moving on. Northwestern and Nebraska. They had that crazy game last year where it looked like Nebraska was going to get their first win under Scott Frost. They completely, choked that game away at the end, and Northwestern kind of started their snowball run to Indy. And now we're at a point where both teams really need to kind of breathe a little life into their seasons, right? Like, you thought Nebraska was going to get a little bit of momentum after beating Illinois. They get waxed by Ohio State. Northwestern's sitting at 1-3 right now, teetering on what could be a descent into maybe a not-so-great season. So what are you looking for out of this game? It's certainly teams with contrasting styles, it seems like. Do you think who do you think, I guess, has the upper edge in this one?
I think Nebraska would have the edge just on paper, but, they seem to have the edge against Northwestern a lot on paper, and that hasn't really seemed to matter. The road team seems to win this game a lot in this series, which is another weird thing. The last 2 games between them have gone to overtime. They've had 5 games in this decade decided by 3 points or fewer. So, this is a game where, I wouldn't be surprised if it came down to a final horn again. Every single game in Lincoln has been decided, in the final couple of minutes. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that happened again. For as bad as Northwestern has looked on offense, they might have figured something out defensively. If that defense could travel for another week in Lincoln, they face a Nebraska team that turns the ball over a lot, has a lot of self-inflicted mistakes. And so, if they find a way to ugly the game up and manufacture some kind of run game, that might be enough to pull it out.
Yeah, Purdue going to Penn State. Purdue's just so banged up. I don't expect that to be much of a challenge for Penn State. So I want to look at Illinois, Minnesota. Kind of a revenge game or an opportunity for the Gophers. I think Minnesota is undefeated since losing to Illinois last year, I believe.
The Cats got them, but that was the only one.
So but it was still kind of the turning point.
Yeah.
They fired their defensive coordinator after Illinois blew them out, and they've been on this really impressive run since. So I just think Illinois probably took advantage of some really bad mismatches for them in the running game last year. Reggie Corbin went wild, and I think they're going to try and do the same this year. I don't think they can match up with Minnesota's skill receivers. Bateman and Johnson are really good, and then you look across the skill spectrum to the running backs, and it's kind of the same deal. So how do you see this playing out? I don't expect it to be a repeat of last year, but do you think there's some sort of advantage that Illinois has that they can take advantage of, or is Minnesota going to coast to 5-0 here?
I don't think Minnesota can coast to anything. That doesn't seem to be in their DNA as of right now. I do think Illinois has a major advantage up front on the defensive side. Minnesota's offensive line has been really, really bad in terms of running the ball and protecting the quarterback. They're the worst team in the Big Ten. Allow 15 sacks already. And they haven't really played, the Chicago Bears, style of defenses.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say Georgia Southern and Purdue and South Dakota State and Fresno State, have a who's who of defensive players, and they still can't protect the quarterback. So, the fact that Illinois, they're a team, even though they give up some big plays, they're a team that creates a lot of them. Obviously they get a lot of sacks. Batiku's one of the best in the country at that, and they create a lot of, tackles for loss. So I think that's the way that they win is, just create all kind of havoc and to make sure Morgan doesn't have time to get the ball to those skilled receivers that you talked about.
Yeah, Morgan's coming off a huge game. Really impressive performance. Wasn't he again, this is a game I didn't get to see a whole lot of, but wasn't he 20 of 23 or something like that?
He was 21 of 22, which is the best. I think it was like 95.5%, which was the best completion percentage by any Big Ten quarterback in a conference game with a minimum of 15 attempts. It was literally the best performance we've seen from a Big Ten quarterback.
Tanner Morgan putting up historic numbers.
Exactly.
It doesn't hurt that he's got, like we said, Bateman and Johnson to throw to. So it could be an intriguing game there, but like we kind of touched on, most eyes will be on the big top 25 matchups within the conference. And this kind of brings me to a final point here, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on, if I'm just not really imagining it, but making too big of a deal out of this, It just seems like this year in college football, there aren't a whole lot of marquee matchups or must-see games yet. That could change. I haven't looked at the schedule across the country, projecting out the rest of the season. But, it seems like throughout this year, it's not like, oh, wait till tonight, there's number 5 versus number 8 coming up, or there's, number 1 versus number 4. It just seems like every week it's kind of a slate that you look at and go, this week's kind of slow. So have you noticed that? Is it going to get better? And why do you think this season has kind of felt devoid of some of the big-time matchups?
Well, I think part of the reason is that the non-conference slate was so bad nationally. There just really weren't a lot of great marquee matchups that kind of get you in the mode for it. So, it's been a lot of blowouts, and we've seen, probably 6 or 7 teams rise above everybody else. You're starting to see a little bit more now that, you get Iowa, Michigan, you get Michigan State, Ohio State, you got Auburn, Florida nationally, you get Red Rivers coming up. Then I know in the Big Ten, the big day is October 26th. That's Michigan, Notre Dame. That's Michigan State, Penn State. That's Ohio State, Wisconsin. So that's gonna be a big weekend to lead you into November before you get your Bama LSU and your Bama Auburn, your Georgia Auburn. Stuff will start to sort itself out here pretty soon. It's just been a slower build than what we're used to.
Sure, and I guess it could be because teams are hesitant to schedule tough out-of-conference games with the way the college football playoff rewards nearly perfect records, and I think it kind of speaks to a antithesis of what I've heard from proponents of a 14 playoff. Like the 14 playoff contingent always seems to argue that if you add more teams, it devalues the regular season. I think it's the opposite. I think we're seeing a devaluing of the regular season, at least in the non-conference, due to the fact that teams want to remain perfect or as close to it and want the easiest path to that. I mean, you look at Clemson; they're going to roll through, probably go 12-0. Probably should have lost last week without really playing anyone of note, not even a top 25 team in there. So it's the only sport that tries to make this argument about the importance of the regular season. No other sport that I can think of really does that. And I think it would make the regular season better because, you look at it now, there's, like you said, 6 teams that are probably on a similar playing field, and 2 or 3 of them are going to get left out.
Yep.
So it's going to be interesting to see. And I think this type of season is the best argument yet for a 6 to 8 team playoff.
Yeah, I agree. I've always been a fan of 6. I don't want 8. I think 8 is almost a little bit too many because then you could still get teams that have 2 or 3 losses potentially make it in a weird year. But I think 6 still works, and the top 2 get by, so you still value the regular season that way. Maybe you get on campus for the first round where it's 3, 6, and 4, 5, and then you go down to your 4 team. You're only adding 2 games. You get a chance to get all 5 champions in if they're deserving. I'm not a fan of you have to put them in, but if they're deserving, like the first year of the playoff when Baylor and TCU both got left out with 1 loss, that's a year where they both could have gotten in and both deserve to do so. I definitely think 6 would be the way to go, but I guess we'll see what happens.
I just think it's going to be one of those things we look back on, just kind of like we look back on voters deciding the national championship game, the national champion, and just look back on maybe 10 years and be like, I can't believe it used to be that way, that we had 4 teams. So
right.
We'll see.
I do think, to your point with the scheduling, that part, I think the Big Ten kind of read it wrong. When people thought that, strength of schedule is going to matter so much, so we need to schedule these really, really tough non-conference games, or we're going to make sure, we don't have any FCS opponents, or we're going to schedule a Power 5 team out of conference, and, we're going to really strengthen this up. But instead, if Penn State doesn't play Pitt and they play somebody else in 2016, they're probably in the playoffs.
Right.
If Ohio State doesn't lose to Oklahoma, they're probably in the playoff. And so, if they don't have these matchups, if they're playing, a MAC school or something else, they're probably in. I mean, Clemson SEC teams, they can play a FCS, they can play 8 conference games and, another bad non-conference game, and it doesn't seem to matter because they can run the table or lose one tough game in conference and people will just give them the benefit of the doubt. So they're not going to change.
Yeah. I wish other conferences would elevate their level to what the Big Ten is, and I like better games. I like fewer cupcakes on the schedule. I think most people would agree with that. It's just kind of one of those things about college football where it's unfortunate there's not a standardized set of requirements for scheduling. So.
Oh, yeah. It's going to be a ton of really good non-conference games next year in the league, so I'm looking forward to that already.
All right. Well, we'll have plenty of time to talk playoff and scenarios and conspiracies coming up once those rankings come out in a few weeks. We'll talk more next week, of course. Enjoy the games this weekend, and we'll do it again soon.
You do the same, man. Have fun.
All right. All right, thanks once again to H and, of course, Mike for joining the show and packing this episode with a ton of good stuff. Thanks, as always, to everyone out there for listening. And if you're listening for the first time or if you're listening on a service that you have not subscribed to yet, be sure to subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Podbean. You can also subscribe to Big Ten Network's YouTube channel and find the Take 10 podcast playlist on that platform as well. So leave a rating and review if you like the show. Save your negative ratings for some other show that I don't care about. And keep coming back and listening and following. Really appreciate it. Thanks as always. Got to give a shout out before we log off to Wes White and Julie Bronder. I think Wes is producing the show, so shout out to them for making the show what it is week in and week out. And we will talk to everyone next time here on the Take 10 podcast.